Good afternoon to everyone from Toronto. I'm here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, still in my office during these somewhat challenging times, but not just saying good afternoon to all of you, I'm also saying to many of you, especially a group of young presenters, and also some of our guests say, a special good evening as well from Toronto. Let me just say a few things before I hand over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Susan Papp, and other speakers today. The book launch and conversation that we're having today, it takes on extraordinary importance. And what's really important about it is that the way this book has brought together so many different young people and young people perspectives, I think that's one thing that stands out. You'll see in the title of the book includes the notion of fresh voices, but also youthful perspectives. And that's, I think, what sets apart this work. And I'm so delighted that Dr. Susan Papp and her work with young people, not just in Hungary, but in Hungarians who count themselves as minorities in neighboring countries, have come together to create this, what to me is a really, really substantial piece of work, and something that I think serves as a model for other books of this type in the future. That's at least what I hope. Now, certainly you're going to learn more about the book as this event progresses. And you're also going to have a chance to engage with these presenters, as we've got a number of them with us today. But as I'm sure all of you know, 2020 was the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Trianon. And I know that the events were a bit different because of the pandemic, and let's say a little bit more subdued because of public health restrictions. But nonetheless, we here at the University of Toronto marked that event in an important way, and actually in a conference organized once again with Dr. Susan Papp. And for me, I teach Hungarian history at the University of Toronto, and I have to tell you, it's an extremely popular course. It's actually one of the most popular, country-specific courses we offer at the university. And explaining the impact of Trianon to students in not just historic, but in contemporary context is crucial, and not just to students of European history, but to any student of history or any student of contemporary history for that matter. And I think that there's really specific reasons to Hungary, but also to Hungarians, as to why this treaty, lives on in a way that's different from other treaties that followed the First World War. I think that it's important that these students, these young people, they're probably best able to capture why this treaty matters 100 years later. So you cannot compare it to other treaties that ended the First World War. Now, before we get to the presentations from the young people, I want to really emphasize and pay special thanks to Dr. Susan Papp, who's the principal organizer, not just of the event, but of the very book that we are celebrating today. She's the editor of the book, and as I said, her work with Hungarian communities in Hungary and with the minority population in neighboring states is extremely important. The other thing I want to say is, you probably are sick of hearing this when you have a Zoom session, is that when Susan and I started talking about this event, and with Emeka Satmari as well, the goal was to have it in person. But things took a bit of a turn for the worse here in the province of Ontario and in the province of Quebec as well, regarding public health restrictions. So we're back in this, what you refer to as a lockdown. But we're on Zoom, and we've actually, ladies and gentlemen, become kind of good at that. And I think we're going to make the best of this. And we have some very prestigious guests as well to join us in the front end before we get started with the student presentations. So in an event like this, there's always a little pre-conversation, what in TV terms we would call a green room. So we just had a delightful conversation, not just with the students, but some of our other special guests. So at this point, I'd like to call on Franz Kalmar, who joins us. I originally wrote down, Ferenc, I wrote down that you were in Budapest, but I learned in the green room that you're actually in the beautiful city of Szeged. So a special welcome to you. And just a quick word, Mr. Kalmar is the Ministerial Commissioner for the Development of Hungary's policies with neighboring countries, which obviously puts him in a special position to give us some remarks about what's ahead of us. Mr. Kalmar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar, and thank you very much for my presentation and my introduction. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I don't know, maybe Mr. Fernando Varen is also here. I would like to special welcome him to this webinar. So in the beginning, I think that the activity of the Rákóczi Foundation in Hungary and in the basin of the Carpathians was and is very, very important. This initiative, what they did, that they wanted, and they managed to make people, young people, to travel to their kin state, to kin country, to Hungary, from the surrounding states, is very important. Me myself, I am originating from Transylvania, and I remember that I was around 16 years old when my father told me that, okay, son, next year we go and see Hungary. I want to show you Hungary, not to be ashamed of your country and of your community and nation. Because you should know that around Hungary, in all these countries, the education was in the sense to make the Hungarian community split and to be absorbed by the majority. So the assimilation, the assimilation was a state rule, a state activity towards the minorities, because they wanted to make ethnically homogeneous countries. So reading this book and editing this book, issuing it, this is a wonderful thing, because we see that after 3-4 generations, yes, history matters, and history is one of the very important sciences, together with literature, which forms the identity of a student, of a young man or a young lady. But that's why it is very important to see that the 3rd, 4th generation in this one, after the peace of or dictatorship of Trianon, after 100 years, still we have this feeling of belonging to the Hungarian community in the youngsters, in the young generation. And what they write there is a very deep feeling about this. So they do not want to give up their identity. And this is very good, because if you, just generally speaking, you know, if somebody gives up his identity, then he will be, as we say, like a leaf, an autumn leaf, which is drifted away by the wind anywhere. So if you have a very strong identity, you have roots, and that's very, very important to have roots, then you can create values. You can you have a history, you have a past, and you will have a future. After 2010, the Hungarian government formulated at least 3 very important principles, which we follow now. The first one was that Hungarian nation is a world nation. You can find us everywhere, from Alaska till South Africa. Then that that each Hungarian counts. This means that we do not, as state, as Hungarian state or kin state, we do not wait for communities in Argentina or anywhere in the world or in Canada to come and try to build up relation with the Hungarian state, but the Hungarian state goes and try and to find all the communities and to build up relations with them. As an example, there is which I have to say that struck me, that south from Buenos Aires, at more than 1,000 kilometers from south from Buenos Aires, our consul diplomat at the embassy in Buenos Aires has found Hungarian communities, and they started to build them up. They started to organize them, and the local authorities were very glad that these communities can be organized and can be they can cooperate with the authorities. So the third very important principle is that we should help our Hungarian communities wherever on the planet to live and prosper on the land where they were born. So this is very important, mostly for those who live in the basin of the Carpathians, because it is not only necessary to have rights for preserving your identity, but it is necessary also to have a living, to give a living to the people. That's why this means that the Hungarian state started economic projects in the neighboring countries. So I think that yes, one more thing what you said, that the Treaty of Trianon had a very strong impact on Hungarians and on Hungary, not only on Hungary and Hungarians, but also on the whole Central Europe, because you know, this they say that after the First World War, ethnic communities were given the possibility to decide where to belong and which country to belong. But for instance, the Hungarians were not allowed it to say their opinion on this. Everybody speaks, for instance, about the Romanian assembly on the 1st of December 1918 in Gyulafehérvár, Alba Iulia, but nobody speaks about the same type of meeting of assembly on the 22nd of December in Kolozsvár, Cluj. Nobody speaks because there the Hungarians said they do not want to join Romania. The Romanians said that they want, but nobody took into account the Hungarian opinion. So I think that this book is very, very important. And, you know, as a politician, there is also a general feeling among us that the young generation is not so interested in history, in politics, and so on. But this is why these kind of books are very important, because they show that this is not true. The young generation also, they try to find their roots, they are looking for their roots, and also they are interested in their future, because politics, through politics, you can build up your future. Thank you very much for the time being.
Thank you very much, Franz Kalmar. And I want a special note, thank you for mentioning the work of the Rákóczi Foundation and the program within that, which is Students Without Boundaries, which is, you know, has provided an enormous amount of opportunity for young people in the region. And again, special thanks to Dr. Pap for making all of that possible. Our next speaker is the ambassador of Hungary to Canada. And it's to my regret that I'm meeting her for the first time on Zoom, but we've already agreed that we're going to meet in person in February, and maybe we can even have dinner at the Consul General's house, which we've been putting off for a couple of years now. So Ambassador Maria Vaz-Salazar, it's with an enormous amount of pleasure that I welcome you virtually to the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Over to you.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and it's a pleasure for me to be here. And in fact, it is a true honor and privilege for me to join you at today's book launch and discussion hosted by the prestigious Munk School. I would like to thank Dr. Susan Pap for inviting me to this event and for her tireless efforts and great achievement as a scholar in fostering a deeper understanding of history and the impact of consequential decisions, such as the Treaty of Trianon had on Hungary and on Central Europe. Also, I would like to express my appreciation to Professor Robert Austin for chairing this event, and would like to recognize distinguished guests, Ministerial Commissioner Franz Kalmar, who we heard from, and is a true champion of minority rights himself, and my dear colleague, Consul General Valir Palkovic. A little over 100 years ago, as a consequence of the Trianon Treaty, millions of Hungarians found themselves under the authority of other countries without leaving their homeland. They became minorities and had to adjust to a new reality. During Hungary's over 1,100-year-long history, the so-called short 20th century, starting from the First World War until the end of communism, was probably the most difficult period. I strongly believe it is important to know the past, to understand historic developments and decisions, and to draw conclusions informed by the consequences of those decisions, whether intended or unintended. Studies and books, such as Voices from the Periphery, make a great contribution to our and our future generations' understanding of the impact of Trianon and the legacy of the past 100 years. I'm also confident that the overlooking approach highlighted in the summary of the book will direct us to a more constructive future, that the values of autochthonous national minorities will be appreciated and their rights observed. I will follow with great interest the presentations by the distinguished speakers at this webinar. I do believe that the voices we will hear will reflect important thoughts about the complexity of living as minorities. Also, I will be eager to learn from Mr. Fernand de Varenne, Special Rapporteur on Minorities for the United Nations, who is a great advocate of minority rights. In conclusion, allow me to congratulate everyone who has contributed to this important book, and we'll be looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Salazar. And again, I look forward to seeing you in Toronto. Just one quick point before I hand over. You'll notice somewhere midway in this afternoon or this evening's discussion, we're going to be joined by Fernand de Varenne, whom, as the ambassador mentioned, is coming to us from the UN. So we're expecting him to appear, I think, at around 2-ish. So keep an eye on that. But in the meantime, I can say with total confidence to Doctors Pap and Satmari that we're off to a really good start. So at this point, I'm going to mute. I'm going to turn off my camera, and I'll just become an ordinary audience member. Susan, over to you, and I'll join you for the Q&A, and I'm looking forward to that. So I usually, I'm so used to clapping, but Zoom has eliminated clapping and to get if you're saying something funny. But Susan, it's such a pleasure to work with you like always. Over to you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much for the kind invitation and the introduction. Very much appreciated. It is my great pleasure to introduce this book, Fresh Voices from the Periphery. This book is truly evidence that history matters. History is not only the study of the past, it is also the examination of how events of the past have impacted lives in the present. This volume is a collection of thought-provoking essays written by young people whose families have lived as minorities in various countries in East Central Europe for 4 generations. They became minorities not because their families migrated to different parts of Europe, but because the borders were changed over their heads. As the famous French poet and novelist Victor Hugo wrote, quote, "What is history? The echo of the past in the future, the reflection of the future on the past." This is what we're documenting in Fresh Voices from the Periphery. Following the end of the First World War, the victorious nations broke up empires and mapped out new successor states. Through the Treaty of Trianon, one of the treaties drafted at the time, the victorious nations sought to create new nation states. but created multi-ethnic states with large minority populations. Hungarian minorities were part of this dictated peace. The essays contained in this volume were submitted through an online competition held by the Rákóczi Foundation of Canada in May 2020. The title of the call for essays was simply, quote, "What does Trianon mean to you today?" End quote. The response was overwhelming. Within a brief span of 30 days, there were almost 100 essays and 5 short films submitted from students and young professionals who have lived for most or all of their developmental years as minorities in Slovakia, Romania, Ukraine, and Serbia. Some respondents are university students, while others have completed their degrees and are working professionals. Some still live in the countries where they were born. Others have left in search of educational and career opportunities in the European Union. These minorities, we've always felt, were the forgotten minorities of Europe. The topic of Hungarian minorities fell into a category of historical memory that, following the Second World War, both in East and West, European nations willingly submerged into, quote, "the freezer of history," end quote, meaning that talking about it was forbidden. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union and other significant geopolitical changes that have unfolded in Europe since 1989, a much debated revival of memory has occurred. 100 years is a very short time in history, and we see and hear of many other forgotten peoples and issues. Until the early 1990s, these young people living in minority status rarely had the opportunity to travel outside their towns and villages, let alone outside their country of birth. Finding your way in the world is especially true for young people living in minority status, as they face the challenges of being accepted in both minority community as well as the majority community. It is a feature of belonging to a minority community to try to understand others as well as oneself, who one is and where one belongs. This volume is part of the ongoing effort to bring the views of these young people to the forefront, to let their voices be heard. They bravely write about the challenges of living on the periphery of countries in which they live, about discrimination, about the many aspects of still waiting after 100 years to belong, and for educational and career opportunities. The essayists share their thoughts and feelings and provide first-person testimony about their lives presently. The fresh voices and views of these young writers are important in bridging the gap of misunderstandings and in healing the wounds. These writings are critical for historians, sociologists, ethnologists, and those generally concerned about the fate of this region to gain a deeper understanding how this generation of young people, representing the 4th generation in their families who have lived in minority status in these countries, perceive the treaty that changed the lives of their families and their communities so dramatically 100 years ago. Their voices offer distinctive perspectives and demonstrate that historical events and the issue of minorities cannot continue to be paved over or placed into the freezer of history. The politics of discrimination and treatment of these minorities as second-class citizens simply cannot continue. Their voices must be heard. This anthology belongs to them, and they are to be commended for writing these outstanding essays. It is with great pleasure that we will present just a few highlights of these essays read by the authors themselves. But first, I would like to introduce Professor Emeka Satmari, who wrote the introduction to this volume. Professor Satmari is a biological anthropologist whose career combined research, teaching, administration, and community service. She served 12 years as president and vice chancellor of the University of Manitoba. She is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, member of the Order of Canada, and Order of Manitoba. Her exact details are too long. Her publications and her accolades are too long to be named here. Professor Satmari was a small child when her family came to Canada. We were very honored that she accepted the task of reading all the essays submitted for this publication and writing a brilliant introduction to the volume. Dr. Satmari.
Thank you very much, Susan. I really appreciate your words, and I really appreciated the opportunity to actually read the essays and then to be able to put them together in some sort of meaningful form. I hate to disagree with the historian that history does not matter. It matters, but believe me, as an anthropologist, culture matters more. And that's what these essays actually indicate. I was asked to talk about the challenges that I had in writing this introduction. And for me, there were several in doing so. The most serious for me was that the book was going to be published in 2 languages, in Hungarian and in English. Therefore, what I wrote had to be meaningful in 2 different worldviews, which disagree about the justice of the treaty that forms the background to the essays in this volume. Notwithstanding that this book launch is taking place in the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies in the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, most Canadians are unfamiliar with Hungarian history. Most have never heard of the Treaty of Trianon, nor do they know its consequences. What they may believe is that a peace treaty that ended World War I a century ago between an enemy of Great Britain, France, and other allied powers must have been just and fair. They would not know that Trianon's terms were dictated rather than negotiated until an agreement was reached. Nor would they know that the treaty required the transfer of 2/3 of Hungarian territory and 1/3 of its population to other states. In effect, most would not know that for Hungarians, the Treaty of Trianon was fundamentally unjust. I had to introduce this background succinctly, factually, and leave the details and arguments to the excellent chapter on the treaty contributed by Dr. Adam Suslik. The second challenge was that the 2 groups of authors whose essays form the heart of this book were given different but related questions to consider. As you heard, the group from the periphery, the lands that were transferred from Hungary to other states, wrote on the topic of what Trianon means to them. The group from Canada wrote on what they learned from their experiences during the summer camps in which they and the young people from the periphery had participated. For an introduction to be meaningful, I had to identify the central concepts that emerged first from the essays written by ethnic Hungarians from the periphery, and then show how these concepts were reflected in the observations of ethnic Hungarians raised in Canada. Fortunately for me, the voices from the periphery were organized into 3 parts, and all 3 have one thing in common. They show that a century after Trianon went into effect, ethnic Hungarians remain members of a minority community in which their individual and collective existences are threatened in the nation states in which they were born and raised. Parts 1, 2, and 3 therefore note the factors essential for Hungarian cultural survival in each of the author's homelands: the preservation of Hungarian language, preservation of Hungarian cultural practices, and respect by the majority for the minority's inherent human dignity. There are also differences among the 3 parts. The first is that it deals with the profound consequence of the Treaty of Trianon, the matter of belonging. Now, the reader may not be surprised that individuals are disdained in their homelands for being outsiders, members of a minority community that does not belong in the given nation state. But it is jarring to read that not belonging is also felt in the motherland for the writers being members of other nation states. And the feeling of being an outsider raises the question, where can I live a life that is meaningful to me? The essayists noted the indignities, the biases, the frank discrimination they experienced in their homelands, and many saw a bleak future for themselves in their home countries. Now, the second part's essays go a step further by searching for paths that might lead to living a meaningful life in their homelands. Some writers expressed a profound loyalty and love to the land where they were born, regardless that those lands were now under another ethnic group's majority control. Their desire was to remain in the villages and towns that their ancestors had established 1,000 years ago, along with the preservation of their Hungarian identity. A few of these essayists also probed the nature of the other, those of the dominant group, and noted situations in which they were able to develop a tentative trust with a majority community member. They found that by listening to other points of view, fostered understanding between both parties, which could lead to improved relations between majority and minority members of their societies. The third part's essays were, for me, tremendously encouraging, largely because the writers refused to be frozen into a victimhood defined by Trianon and identified what was necessary for them to live and to thrive as contributing members of the societies into which they were born. To the freedom to learn and to use their Hungarian language and customs without negative repercussions from the majority, they added becoming fluent in the majority's language in their homelands, acting on what they believe is best for them without waiting for any government to make their lives better. And third, focusing on achieving a peaceful coexistence or a reconciliation with majority members of their home countries. There was an energy in many of these essays that signaled a self-direction and confidence in oneself. The fourth part, which contained the Canadians' essays, displayed dual perspectives on their fellow campers from the periphery, as well as the people that they encountered in the countries that they visited. In effect, their essays displayed their dual identities as ethnic Hungarians and as Canadians. They recognized that it was significantly easier for them to retain their Hungarian language and cultural practices in Canada because Canadian laws and Canadian attitudes made it safe for them to do so. They grew up without being hated for being different. Could it be so for the ethnic young Hungarians living on the periphery? Well, that leads me to the third challenge I faced in writing the introduction, lest I be accused of being a Pollyanna. I had to show Hungarians who are uninformed about Canada's internal problems as a multi-ethnic state, what Canada did to promote multiculturalism and show its moral value and practical utility to Canadians. Well, an example of this is Canada's focus, or at least recently, on achieving reconciliation between its Indigenous minorities and the majority comprised of generations of settlers from other lands. Historic failures in Canada's treatment of Indigenous peoples were documented by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015, and there is no escaping its indictment or its recommendations for change. A government can admit the wrongs of its predecessors, wrongs that they have done for 150 years. A government can change its policies and lead its population to change in attitude. The Canadian experience actually shows that where there is a will, there is a way to live together. Respecting each other's ethnic origins and identities engages everyone in purposeful collective action, and respect for human rights enables everyone to build a stronger multi-ethnic nation. All young people want to live meaningful lives, and I believe such goals can be achieved in the lands where the essayists from the periphery were born and raised, when respect for human rights takes root in their multi-ethnic communities. I hope you read the essays thoroughly and think about them. It's well worth the effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emeka. It was, as always, delightful to see your impact, to hear your impact, your impressions of this project. I'd like to now introduce the four presenters who have each written essays in different parts of the book. The last one will be Canadian. The three are from various countries in East Central Europe. Johanna Barotti-Sabo is from Transylvania. She has changed her name to Barotti-Sabo because she just recently got married in December. She is currently working as regional manager of the Matthias Corvinus Collegium. She coordinates the youth talent program for elementary students in Sfântu Gheorghe Covasna, Sepsișani, in Romania. Students are offered an opportunity to acquire practical experience in fields that are closely related to everyday life, but not available in public education. Furthermore, her program provides a solid base for their later career choices. Welcome, Johanna.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introducing, dear Zsuzsa. I'm happy to be here and I could share the essential part of my writing about Trianon. The title of my essay is Historical Musings. What do the sad historical facts say? Trianon, the charnel house of Hungarian future, where they signed an agreement so painful for millions, the harshest and most unjust punishment, the dismemberment of our country. Trianon, June 4, 1920. On that fateful day, all the church bells rang, factory sirens wailed, traffic stopped for minutes, schools were closed, flags flew at half-mast, and the hearts of 8 million Hungarians filled with grief. What do I know of Trianon? That if political interests require it, the end always justifies the means, and the strong think they can do anything because the weak have to bow down must bear all. That I have a land of my birth, a country of my birth, a mother country, dual citizenship, yet no real freedom because Romania, although a constitutional nation state, in reality employs discriminative treatment. It is a multinational country denying that fact, and here at home, I am obligated to speak, understand, and communicate in Romanian, like it or not. That it is an uplifting feeling hearing pure Hungarian speech. When stepping across the border, I meet my relatives, friends, and co-workers. That tears gather in my 80-year-old grandmother's eyes when she thinks of our ancestors, of her father, whom she didn't even know because he was a proud Hungarian and went among the first to fight to defend their secular land, and that beside the map of the secular counties hangs a map of Greater Hungary, which reminds us that we have a right to remember. That at the events of our mournful celebrations, when we meet a few times a year at memorial monuments in the center of the Guild town to remember heroes, then we feel truly Hungarian under the red, white, green, and secular flags. That I can thank my parents' diligent upbringing for this feeling. I was born a Hungarian and I am a Hungarian. That Hungarians are dwindling, Hungarian consciousness is weakening, and that there is a need for the European Union to recognize the territorial and cultural self-determination of Hungarians outside the borders so that we may become stronger. That evoking the events of Trianon, sharing our thoughts, asking the appropriate questions, and communicating may take us closer to finding answers, solutions. What is the condition of preservation? A people, a fraction of a people, a minority, a community, a person, all have as a weapon the word, their mother tongue that distinguishes their nation from other nations. The key to our preservation and continuation is our shared language, because if one doesn't know Hungarian or doesn't understand Hungarian words, you are not Hungarian. What is the common European future? What are the possibilities? What can we do? The common European future is a vision, a fantasy of the creation of a well-functioning and developing empire. We know that the goal of the common European future is integration, the acceptance of those norms, values, and ideas that bind Europeans together over national and state boundaries. Sameness and a common identity, or the highlighting of differences. That has long been a topic of argument among the thinkers of Europe. Our grandfathers and grandmothers held, as we hold to, that there is no serenity, inner calm, or happiness without knowing who you are, where you came from, where you belong, and in what direction you are going. As there is no tree without roots, there is no nation without a past. We cannot unfurl our wings to fly into the future if we lack a warm, soft nest. The civil associations here locally and in the mother country, or even those supported by Hungarians living abroad, have a large task in this. A grateful thanks goes to the Rákóczi Foundation. For us, secular Hungarians living in Transylvania, the message of Trianon is clear. Although power might win, no unjust treaty can rend asunder the 1,000-year unity of Hungarians. How to proceed on the path of the future? We ask for so little and at the same time for so much: rights for us, an indigenous ethnic minority, so that we can feel ourselves as Hungarians here on the ancestral land, that we can openly cultivate our ethnic consciousness and pass it on to our children. In other words, the universal right for autonomy along with complete cultural and territorial autonomy. I believe it is wise to remain a true Hungarian, to emotionally identify with the ancient Hungarian value system and symbols. I believe there is always hope for a better future. I believe that these aims are possible and must be acted on, so that for the youth of today, Trianon is not only a history lesson at school to which they feel no emotional connection, but is rather linked to understanding the connections between past, present, and future, and perhaps to the wisdom we need to create a better home. Thank you, dear audience, for the patient listening. I hope my English was understandable.
It was perfect. Thank you so much, Johanna. Thank
Thank
you. We
you.
really appreciated it. Going on to our next speaker, who is Genovevas Vingola. She is 21 years old and lives in Transcarpathia in Ukraine. As a recent graduate of the University of Debrecen in July of last year, she became a cultural community coordinator. After graduating, she returned to Transcarpathia and will soon be working at a company that aims to develop and support local cultural communities and cultural spaces. She hopes that as a member of this company, she will be promoting the survival of Hungarian community in Transcarpathia. Welcome, Genoveva.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here and share my thoughts about our life here in Transcarpathia. So here's a small part from my essay. 100 years have passed, a long, long time. Yet we receive something that beats as strong after a century as it did back then. What this dictated peace brought with it, I can only comment on from a Transcarpathian perspective, as it affects all of us differently, some for the better and some for the worse. Our Hungarianness and the tasks that lie ahead, however, are the same. Ukraine is attempting to modernize and would like to become a member of the European Union. However, in theory and practice, this seems at odds with the facts. Laws are passed that make the life of minorities living in the country impossible. Fundamental rights are being taken away. The use of our language is forbidden in school, at work, in offices, even on the street. The heads of surrounding countries say that these repressive laws are not allowed and can't be done by anyone. And since we can't, we have the same rights as anyone else. And yet, it is being done. We have no alternative. We would like to adapt, but how? Teachers do not receive adequate training, and there are not enough Ukrainian language textbooks. The resources necessary to accomplish what we are asked to do are not ensured. The other big problem is there are few jobs in Transcarpathia, and there are often occasions in which people are not hired because they speak Hungarian, even though they speak fluent Ukrainian as well. In many official situations, they simply ignore us, not taking us seriously. On the dates of Hungarian historical commemorations, they invented Ukrainian ones and forced us to celebrate those in the schools and in kindergartens. They tried to oppress us, whereas all we want is to live in peace and as Hungarians in our dear Carpataya, which is the center of our heart, our home, our everything. We are discriminated against both here and in Hungary. They do not like us in one place because we are Hungarians, in the other because we live in Ukraine. And yet, when someone asks if I like living in Carpataya, my unequivocal answer is yes. This is my home, everything and everyone I love are here, and I would never leave them. I recently finished my university studies in Debrecen, but afterwards I came home to work. As there is so much to do, someone has to stay home. I can see a future in Transcarpathia, a future worth fighting for. There's a sore point in all our hearts, a wound that is sometimes torn open daily and poked at, one that will never heal. But we have learned to live with it. In fact, truthfully, it is what made us who we are today, able to endure all, tolerate all, and become resilient survivors. All the while, we are alive, sensitive, and able to grasp the moment. We smile or cry at the same line of a song. We can be very joyful and can love deeply. We see the miracles of life, both small and large, because we see the world differently. We have learned to value what is ours. We sweat blood for it every day. Our language, our culture, our songs, and our dances. Nobody can take that away from us. We are in God's hands. We are Hungarians. This is the greatest strength that maintains us. No matter the number of governments, politicians, enemies, or trials that may come, we will endure. We will stay here and we will endure because we are Hungarians. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Genoveva. We really appreciate your heartfelt presentation. We'd like to welcome Fernand de Varenne, UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. And we're very grateful that you could make it to today's session. And as soon as our next student presenters are done, we will turn to you. I already have some questions for you. So thank you very much for making time today. We're very honored. Balint Tibor is a computer scientist from Törökbece, Novi Bece, Serbia. In spite of his youth, he has traveled to many places and has become familiar with many diverse cultures. Currently, he's finishing his last year at the University of Szeged. Through the Students Without Boundaries program, he met and became familiar with the story of Shuti, a Holocaust survivor. This left such a deep impression in him that in his high school years, he prepared 2 Holocaust-themed programs, both dedicated to Shuti's memory. The programs were presented at Novi Sad Genius Student Contest to great acclaim. Welcome, Tibor.
Thank you, Janine, for the kind presentation, and I would like to welcome every one of you, including our special guests tonight. And I would like to to ask for your excuse me for because of the surrounding noise around me. If it is a bother anytime during my presentation, I would like to show and to present you the views of the Hungarians living in Vojvodina, which is currently located in Serbia, and the way we survived during the last 100 years. My presentation, or actually my work my work's title was translated by me, and it sounds something like one of the biggest plague spots of Europe and the whole world in English. As a Hungarian living outside the border of Hungary, I do not feel I can form an objective opinion about the dictated Peace of Trianon. At least I cannot. It is interesting to look back on it a century later. My generation was not present when the big ones, in quotes, committed it to paper, yet we still live in the aftermath and with attended consequences. I know everyone has had enough of hearing or reading the sort of news item that pleads for the help of Hungarian communities outside of Hungarian border, but the reality is that without such support we cannot exist. It is notable that when I stop in Hungary to talk with a local individual, sooner or later we get to the subject of ancestry, as in with the question, "Where are you from?" directed at me. And I proudly admit to being from Törökbece, which is currently called Novi Bece, and it's located in northern Serbia, which is followed by the unusual question, "Where is that?" And after I answer that question also, if follows one of the most indelicate and hurtful questions, "Where did you learn to speak Hungarian so well?" I thought long about what would have happened if the dictated peace had not been signed. Then in my imagination, we would be part of the mother country, and no one in the world would question my Hungarianness and wouldn't be surprised by how well I speak the language. The biggest problem is that I don't feel at home anywhere. Here among Serbs, I will always be a minority. In Hungary, since I attend university there, I will always be a Serbo-Hungarian, a Yugoslav maybe, or even a Serb. But the question remains, what has this to do with Trianon? I grew up in Törökbece, where I played out in the fields among the ruins of the church of Arac, which is called Aracha in Serbian, while my grandfather checked on our beehives. We spent a lot of time on the streets until the late evening hours with my friends, Serbians and Hungarians, all alike together. But when I entered school, I realized that the world is not black and white as I had seen it. The older children constantly harassed us. A friend was not allowed to go home until he sang the Serbian national anthem. And a lot of similar situations happened also. We continually asked, why is this necessary? My father's not particularly interested in history. Obviously, he knows about the conquests, King Saint Stephen, King Matthias, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but he's not particularly interested in the revolts of 1848 or 1956 or the Treaty of Trianon. Feelings of patriotism have been thought out, in quotes, of the thinking of his generations. In school, they learned of the victorious battles of the partisan units in the history of the Serbian ruling monarchy. Generations grew up in former southern Hungary, and their national history sank into forgetfulness. as it was not taught in schools. In some families, little children heard from their parents of the heroes who fought on the Italian front, of grandfathers and great-grandfathers who shed their blood for freedom. It was that way with us too. My grandmother told us many fascinating stories, most of which I did not understand at the time, although every word reverberates in me like a sort of sermon today. She would tell me the stories of my great-great-grandfather who returned from the Italian front during the First World War with a bullet wound that became infected years later and would eventually lead to his death. Hearing of the suffering of my great-grandparents in the newly formed kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenians, actually, sorry, and of how for a Hungarian life was not good here in Banat, and how was the former Banat sliced into three parts, the Serbian, the Hungarian, and the Romanian part, thus ruining its economy, and how more taxes were levied onto the entire region so that the underdeveloped south of Serbia would be brought up to the level of the former always well-off Hungarian area of Vojvodina, or Délvidék as we call it. This memory and situation has remained to this day in the everyday lives of people. Trianon made us far stronger, more cohesive, even richer in culture and traditions. We now value more of what we have long fought for as a minority in our own land and strive to regain those rights that are rightfully ours. Parents are now consciously and continuously and deliberately sending their children to learn folk dances so that they will learn their ancestors' legacy, first through games and later through folk culture. Thus, young people travel the Hungarian populated regions with their instructors while forming personal contacts and passing on the histories of their village, family, and community, reaching the goal of having their culture stay alive for the next generations. I would like to thank all of you for listening to my long presentation of my work, and I would like to thank the Rákóczi Foundation for the continual support of us, of Hungarian minorities, and for the chance to experience their great work in the years that have passed since I've been to their summer camp, Students Without Boundaries. And I would like to thank Susan Pop actually for her tremendous help during these years. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Tibor. Thank you very much for your presentation. I apologize as well for the noise in the background. It was very good. I'd like to introduce our last student speaker. Andrew Dioshadi belongs to a different class of essayists. He was born and raised in Toronto to immigrant parents, and they arrived in Canada after the 1956 revolution. He graduated from the University of Toronto's Department of Chemical Engineering and has been a registered professional engineer since 2009. He's been involved with these young people and the leadership of the foundation, and he has been traveling the world on integrating configuration and design of many large integrated petrochemical facilities around the world. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you for this opportunity. I thought I would share a little bit of the essay that I had written, quickly putting where I joined with the Students with Boundaries, and then two experiences I had with the students in two of these regions where they face minority challenges. So despite all my years of exposure to minority rights violations, it was at the Rákóczi Foundation's Students Without Boundaries program where my exposure to these violations started to mesh with a deeper understanding of the prevalence of these issues and a yearning to start addressing this on a wider scale. My experience with Students Without Boundaries was not the conventional experience of attendees. I attended first as an assistant leader and then as a group leader in charge of the 50 students for the duration of the program. One of the important activities in the program is an evening in which students brainstorm about what it would take to make their lives easier and better while living in minority status. This is something most have never thought of doing, even though they have experienced some level of discrimination their entire lives. The Canadian leadership in this program is particularly important as our experience with what I refer to as a functional multiculturalism allows us to share a more positive side of things. The concept that sharing one's culture with others as an educational process whereby we show why we are proud of who we are and where we come from is simply foreign to many of the student participants in the program. For them, any cultural festival would be in defiance of local rules and would simply be a show of solidarity amongst themselves. In Canada, where cultural festivals are a norm, we have long ago realized that culture isn't a competition. It is not possible to convert someone to your culture. You can simply have people understand and perhaps appreciate your culture, your history, customs, and perhaps learn about famous individuals. In some very rare cases, others may adapt into their own lives some aspect of your culture they find particularly useful or intriguing. Things such as cuisine, dancing, or music are the most common. I have always believed that more information allows you to make better decisions in life. The first year that I attended Students Without Boundaries, we had a day trip to Košice in Slovakia. The other leaders were weary because in the past there have been problems with locals being angry with visiting Hungarian groups. As we walked through the center of town, we were followed by a small group of locals who were swearing at us and telling us to go back to Hungary. The reaction in the group was to stick together, to travel through the town center quickly, and to try to get to a safe spot inside the museum we wanted to visit. The small group, however, continued to shout at us from the gates of the museum, and not even the Slovakian-born students among us were willing to say anything. It showed a cultural divide, one that was deeply ingrained, and students had never been empowered or shown methods to try to de-escalate such situations. Fear always ruled. I later witnessed this type of cultural discrimination while on a trip through Transylvania on behalf of the foundation. I boarded a train with some of our past participants, speaking in Hungarian. The train was full, so I took my assigned seat in the compartment full of Romanian students. They greeted me when I sat down, and I said hello, not speaking a word of Romanian myself. They tried to be friendly, but got ever more agitated that a Hungarian from the region was too proud or arrogant to speak the national language. At that point, they had no way of knowing that I was not a local, but they typecast me because they had heard me speaking Hungarian as I boarded the train. It took some real effort on my part to explain that I was a Hungarian Canadian, just visiting the region before they changed back to a positive attitudes toward me. It showed how much historical stereotypes are harming the region and how easily honest and open communication can break down these barriers. I feel that each leader sharing these experiences at Student Without Boundaries is bringing about a change to East Central Europe, whereby a greater appreciation of neighbors, more inclusive attitudes, and open and honest dialogue is building a stronger and more sustainable community. Students Without Boundaries is helping the region to achieve its true potential, and we are developing a group of young leaders who are able to impart an inclusive, positive influence across the region in all of Europe and beyond, both now and well into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And my apologies for the delay. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Fernand de Varenne. United Nations Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. We're so happy you could join us. Dr. Verheyen is a Canadian citizen and teaches at the Faculty of Law at several universities. In addition, he travels the globe reporting on minority issues to the United Nations. His list of accolades and publications are too many to list. Dr. Verheyen, I've been looking at some of your interviews online, and I have would like to start out with one question for you. You've spoken extensively about, quote, minority rights being human rights, end quote, with special reference to the minorities emphasized in this volume or book that we're about to launch. How do you counteract the widely professed defense on the behalf of governments around the world that, quote, sovereignty of the state, end quote, trumps everything else, and that in fact governments can act unchallenged in their treatment of minorities?
Thank you very much, first of all, Mrs. Papp, for the kind presentation, Excellencies. My dear friend, Commissioner Kalmar, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, everyone. Yo napot kivanok. Bonjour. I guess the important point to always remember, keep in mind, and to refer to is that whether you're a majority or a minority, you do have human rights. Everyone has human rights in international law, and quite often some of the situations, even some of the incidents that I heard earlier, can involve issues either such as hate speech or discrimination against minorities. And so I think this is something very fundamental that is not always well understood. Even with some governments in Europe, there is sometimes a tendency to consider minority rights as something different, as not your same as basic human rights such as freedom of religion or freedom of expression. That's wrong, to be very clear. There is a profound misunderstanding as to what is meant conceptually by minority rights. And just to be clear, minority rights means the human rights of minorities as understood in international law. And amongst the most important of that is the right to equality, of being equal in dignity and respect, and equal in the rights that we are entitled to actually enjoy. And that applies also to minorities. Unfortunately, some governments don't really understand what that means in practice in relation to issues such as language or religion or culture. And this is where we need actually to have greater clarification and understanding and implementation of these human rights, particularly for minorities.
Thank you. Very comprehensive. One more question, if I may. I've read in one of your interviews that you are an optimistic person, despite enormous problems around the world in this issue. What words of encouragement would you provide to these young people who had the courage to write down about the discrimination they face on a daily basis, the hardships in their lives as minorities, who may have put themselves out to criticism and possible backlash for doing so?
I would urge them to persevere. There is nothing in life which is guaranteed. There is no easy way out of difficult situations. And if you look at history, history shows that in relation to minorities in particular, whether we think about Jews, the treatment of Jews, the Jewish minority during the Second World War, whether we think about the Roma across many countries in Europe and how they are treated, or even if we think of Indigenous peoples in Canada or Afro-Americans in the United States, their human rights have taken decades to have recognized sometimes, but it's only through perseverance, through insistence, to also being activists, to actually fighting and working for these human rights, can we hope to actually move forward and make progress. And especially because of the theme of the book, Voices from the Periphery, but also your direction, your orientation towards the future. You have to look towards the future, how it is important not to give up, because by giving up, nothing will change. It is by perseverance and also by working with organizations that deal with the respect of the rights of Hungarian minorities or other minorities, and also the various mechanisms and organizations that are involved for human rights. It's only by continuing to persevere, to have the courage to look at improving, at looking at the possibility of moving forward. Can we actually make progress? And therefore, that would be my message for today's launch, given the theme of the book launch for today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to hand over the chair position to Professor Robert Austin, who will be directing questions to you and to the panelists as well. Thank you.
Hello again, everybody, and thank you so much, Professor de Varenne. I didn't, I looked at your bio and I somehow, forgot you're Canadian. Where were you born in Canada?
I am, and I'm also currently in New Brunswick. So I'm a French Canadian, an Acadian from New Brunswick, even though I'm also an Australian and I have associations around the world in many different countries.
I can tell, well, just anecdotally, my son is a Fredericton young man. He headed east a few years ago and never looked back.
Okay, good to hear.
He's really enjoying himself out there. But your message in the two questions that Dr. Papp asked, your message is really important for these young people. And I want to say, because I'm sitting here listening to these presentations, what struck me is, first of all, how wonderful they all were. That's a given. But and Susan, you know this, like it's so authentic for me. To listen to these people tell a story, and it's not a story told with anger or bitterness. It's a story told with passion and to Professor de Varenne's point, a passion for a better future. As you just said, it's all about the future. And growing up in Toronto, like me, born here, I tell my students all the time, you always have to try to think like a minority. And this is something that doesn't always come easy to people, especially, Susan knows what Toronto was like in the 60s and 70s, and Fernand de Varenne, you probably know too, but in Toronto, it was very different than it is now, put it that way. So you have to be mindful that, the people around you are coming at things from a very different experience. You have to be particularly mindful when you work at a university, which has also faced its own challenges on some of these issues that the students talk about. So today I took away so many different ways of thinking about my own life, about thinking about how I interact with my students. And again, as I said at the beginning, when you teach Hungarian history and you talk about 1920, and I think Franz Kalmar is 100% right, it's not just an issue for Hungarians or Hungary, it's an issue for Central Europe, it's an issue for Europe, and then it becomes, to your point, Professor de Varenne, it's a global thing, but I'm still, dead set on making sure that, at least within the context of Hungarian history, a young person who's not connected to Hungarian history and who takes it out of interest can understand why 1920 matters a lot in 2022. And you get that sense when you listen to these youngsters, because again, the story is so absolutely authentic. So, Susan, what I'm going to do, with your permission, is I'd like to engage some of these youngsters in my own class, because I don't know why it took a pandemic to convince people that you can have people come from other countries on Zoom. I keep saying, like, we could have done that before. It seemed to make it so imperative now. So Susan, let's regroup on that, because I really think that having those students of that same age talk to students of that age in Toronto, and the Toronto setting, has an enormous impact, and it makes it real, and it makes it absolutely personal. So having said that, I didn't know I would end up talking so much. I apologize, but I really enjoyed listening to everybody, and I feel a sense of enthusiasm. And to your point, Fernand, I feel a sense of optimism. Okay, I really do, and I appreciate your remarks. So now we have some time for questions. You can ask questions to the students, you can ask questions to our special guests. I encourage you to go with the students first, because today is really about them. Stacy from Monk School is working with me. She's not in the Monk School like me, she's in her house. Stacy, are we set with some questions, or if maybe I'll ask Susan or Emeka to get the ball rolling? Well,
Okay.
Stacy,
I'd be happy
Susan,
to.
you good with that?
Yeah,
Okay.
just fine. One of the things that struck me as the editor of this volume is that the most submissions came from Transcarpathia, from Ukraine. And obviously there are lots of different issues in Ukraine. that are very pertinent and topical, and war is about to break out, and Russian troops are on the other side of the country. And so Ukrainians have become quite defensive about a lot of these issues. But why in particular, a minority group, which is 150,000 strong, very close to the edges, has never really wanted anything but to be left in peace and to maintain their educational institutions. Why all these laws have suddenly come in, these language laws, is ununderstandable to me. When Ukrainians understand what it is like to be oppressed by the Soviet Union, when they were part of the Soviet Union, they weren't allowed to move freely, use their language as freely as they are, obviously under their own country. So there were distinctly the majority of students who wrote came from Transcarpathia. 13 in all are published in the volume. Transylvania is next, which is 11. Serbia is 6. Obviously, Serbia is a sign where there might be some hopefulness, because Serbia is the only country in my knowledge that has recognized the collective rights of Hungarian minority. Slovakia has had its ups and downs. Unfortunately, it's now over that language law that it had that was so damaging to Hungarians as well. And there were 2 from Hungary and 6 from Canada. So in total, 100 submissions. And out of that, we chose 42 writings that were distinct, that were different, that had something very meaningful to say. I did want to remind the audience that the book, the English language book, is available on Amazon.ca and Amazon.com. And we will put up a slide at the end, basically saying where it is available. It is also available at a separate web shop in Europe, in Romania. I found it, I would like to hand it over possibly to Professor Satmari if there are no questions up to now, because she had a different light on it completely. All 4 of her grandparents were also affected by the Treaty of Trianon. They all had to move from the regions where they lived into Rump, Hungary, the way it's called. So Emeka, I'm not sure if you would speak to maybe the issue of your family's history possibly, or what you saw in these essays that was so outstanding.
Thank you for that question, but I think the young people's views are really what struck me most of all. I'm likely the oldest participating today because my 78th birthday is coming up. And I've lived in Canada since 1951, so that gives you some sense. Before that, 6 years in DP camps. So when sometimes people ask, who are you, where are you from? I say, well, I'm a DP, a displaced person, because that's what I am. And of course, older Canadians are shocked that one would say this because they remember how some DPs were treated. It wasn't until the Hungarian Revolution that, in fact, attitudes in Canada changed significantly towards welcoming refugees. So a lot of the earlier ones were accepted, because they accepted them, but that didn't make life easy. I was really struck. I'm very fortunate because I can still speak, not all that well, but certainly speak, read and write in Hungarian. And I asked to read those essays initially in the Hungarian language. And then I read them in English. For those of you English speakers who don't know Hungarian, I can tell you the translations are superb. There is no other way to express them, both in terms of substance and style and the emotional import that they have. But what I was struck by was my reaction to the Hungarian language version of the essays, because they had a much deeper resonance for me than it did reading them in English. English, to some degree, has a protective emotional distance that it affords. I don't think that there's anybody in the globe, unless they grow up in a really extremely privileged circumstances, that doesn't face some sort of inequity sometimes. As a little kid on the playing field, they don't pick you for the team. You know, everybody knows what these kind of hurts are like, but that they should persist, and that they should persist so openly and be newly introduced, as in the case of Ukraine, really is heartbreaking. And I don't think that it's wise only to dwell on the emotional significance. I think I agree with Dr. de Varenes that we really have to look to the future, especially as the third part looks to the future, on how these young people can have meaningful lives. And that is a phrase that encompasses a lot. That includes an economic future, that includes maintenance of cultural identity, and an actual living, strong contribution to the place where they are born. Why the local governments do not appreciate that these people don't want to take anything away from the majority, they want to add to that richness. That's what the Canadian perspective, I think, brings. And I think the Canadian perspective is also that, well, you know, we weren't so great here in Canada sometimes. We did some terrible things. And the Indigenous one is just the recent acknowledgement of the wrongs and hurts of the past and how we go about fixing them. Dr. de Varenes is of Acadian ancestry. There's a lot of rotten things going on even before Canada was formed. So, you know, we have experience as a nation doing that. And somehow we've managed to forge to date a common cultural identity while we pay attention to our roots. And that's a work in progress. And I really hope that that kind of opportunity comes to the young people living in the periphery, as well as those of ethnic Canadians who are living in Canada.
I also have, I know we have some questions. I'm not going to jump in, but Robert, I have a question after we're done with the,
Oh, super.
with the questions.
Why don't
Okay.
you, and I see Ambassador Salazar has a question too. But Susan, one quick, can I give you a short one first? Because it's kind of
Sure.
an easy answer. Do you mind?
Sure.
And if it looks like I'm typing, it's because I have to look at this chat box and then try to listen.
Me
And it's
too.
not the easiest thing to do. I think this is from your sister, by the way. And I take the opportunity to say hi to your sister. I haven't seen her in years, but I guess like the rest of us, like she's stuck somewhere. And it's an important question, which is, what are you going to do? It's essentially, are you going to publish the online, perhaps, the essays that did not make it into the book? Because as you said, it was a competition. What's the plan for those other essays?
Probably they will appear on a website or a Facebook page,
Okay.
because there were films as well that came up. I mean, really brilliant, well done films. And they should also be on a Facebook page or a YouTube channel. I'm not sure what the fate of those will be right now. There is an ebook option that's also available. You can order it as an ebook, and you will, we're also thinking of publishing it in various languages: Romanian, Serbian, Slovak, Ukrainian. I think it would be very useful for the counterparts in those countries to read and hear about what these students believe and hear. So to break down those barriers that.
Excellent. So I think, Susan, the best thing to do is you ask your question, because then I'm going to kind of collate. I've got a question that will go to all the students that they can all comment on. I have one myself on my own, but I might put that to the end. So you go ahead now, and then I'll come back to the student question and then to the ambassador.
Okay. I would like to ask Professor Fernand de Varan, what is it that he believes? He's an optimistic person. Obviously, there are horrible human rights abuses happening to people like the Rohingya, like anyway, I don't have to name them to you because you know them. I'm just wondering what the UN can do optimistically, best option. What is it? What are the steps that need to be taken when someone wants to report human rights abuses to the UN?
Thank you very much, Kusana. There are, of course, many different mechanisms at the United Nations. So depending on what kind of situation you have, and also the gravity of the case or the whether there are atrocities or even worse being committed. So you have to look at there are what we call special procedures, including myself as an independent expert, a special rapporteur, where we are in fact, in a sense, a complaint mechanism. We can raise certain issues that are brought to our attention through diplomatic channels to the governments involved, reminding them of their human rights obligations. That's one mechanism. You also have different human rights committees at the United Nations. There is also the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations. And in some cases where an issue can be destabilizing for peace and stability in a region, even the UN Security Council can get involved. Now that's in terms of the United Nations, and it's more diplomatic pressure, if you will, but also raising the visibility and awareness about certain human rights concerns. Sometimes, in other words, pressure and pointing the finger at a government may lead to some improvement. On the other hand, I think it's always important to remember that the public and other human rights organizations have a role to play. It's important to realize that being an activist, being an advocate for human rights can sometimes be of great assistance. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch are areas where individuals, you and I, and young people can get involved to try to make a difference. And so I think it has to be kept in mind that trying to change a system or a government's policies is never simple. It's never straightforward. It can be an extremely long and an extremely painful process. But there are ways of engagement. There are ways of trying to make a change, whether it is through civil society organizations like Amnesty International, whether it is with other activist or advocate groups, or whether it is with approaching more formal processes like involved with the United Nations and even the Canadian government, as a matter of fact, and members of parliament can be asked to intervene in some cases. So there's a lot of possibilities. And I think it's important as an optimist, once again, to always keep in mind that change requires effort. And nothing will happen unless we believe in it and we actually try to make a difference, try to make a contribution along the many different possibilities, some of which I've mentioned.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, Susan, I'm going to go to a question for the students, and I think the best thing would for them to answer it in the order they presented. It would give me each a chance because it's a general question. I'll read it out loud. Could the young people speak a little more to the impact and experience of the camp they attended through the Rákóczi Foundation? So, Joanna, Joanna, are you there? The students can put on, by the way, I'd like to encourage the students to put on their cameras. It's Zoom. The real shortcoming is not seeing you. Leave your cameras on. You know, some of you are meeting for the first time. Actually, most of you are meeting for the first time. Joanna, are you there?
Yeah. Perfect.
Maybe she's not there. And then Tibor, how about Tibor? Tibor, how about you jumping in here?
I'm up for it. Sure, as you wish. Well, I had my experience. I think it was 2015, the year that I attended the camp, which was held by the Rákóczi Foundation. Well, the experience was actually mind-blowing, to say the least. It was a really difficult. It's a really difficult thing to express to someone, as you may know, Professor, by your teachings of different people, the Hungarian culture and its history. Well, it's really difficult to express how I felt meeting people from around these peripheries, that so-called peripheries that were torn away in the dictated peace. I got to play the national anthem, our national anthem, on an organ in a church where Kossuth Lajos, and you obviously know who Kossuth Lajos is, one of the leading figures in the revolution of 1848. I got to play it in the church where he was christened in Hungary.
Wow.
So it's a really deep emotional state that all of us were in back there. And as Susan, as Zsuzsanényi told, I got so emotionally attached to the story of Shruti Bacsi that I wrote to well, they were actually some kind of essays also, but they were my works for two competitions that I got I think third and second place consecutively, one after the other. So they were really highly recognized works because of the originalness of the writing, the deep connection, the personal bond that I had with him, of meeting him, and through personally hearing his story back then. Obviously, he passed away since, God rest his soul. He passed away right before I had the chance to hold my second presentation in the finals at the second competition, and I asked Zsuzsanényi for her blessing to dedicate my work to his memory, because he was a special man, and that's what the camp brought to me, to a lot of my fellow friends, actually, as I like to call them, because we had a meeting back then which was in person, and since then we only had the chance of talking to each other through online video calls, because of the vastness that were spread throughout this Central and Eastern Europe. And it's quite sad. It's quite sad that this COVID era brings a stop to all of that we had back then, the freedom, the connectedness, the openness, and everything. And I'm really hoping that we'll have a chance to meet everyone in person again, because that's the ultimate goal of everyone who visits the summer camp, is to have another meeting, and after that another one and another one, because there's not enough time to discuss our feelings and our emotions during those 10 days. It's not enough.
Well, thank you very much. Genoveva, how about you? Do you want to jump in here?
Yes, of course. First of all, it was a lifelong experience for sure. And I met a lot of new people there, and I still have friends from the camp. And when I went to the university, I went there alone, and I didn't know anyone, but I had friends from the camp, and it helped me a lot to adapt for the new situation, because I had people I know, and it was just a feeling. I think none of us can explain what it feels like to be, what it was to be there in the camp, because it felt like we were in a safe place, like home, because we had people around us who knew our situation, where we came from, our struggles, because they had the same ones, and we still have our group chat from the camp, and I think we had gained friendships that will last for our entire life. And the worst thing was that we can't go back again.
I understand. And Andrew spoke very specifically to some of his experiences. I'm going to ask a question that comes from Susan, but I'm going to ask it, okay, Susan? And because I'm interested in the question as well, Susan. So Genoveva, you're still talking. Could you tell us a little bit more about the situation in Transcarpathia right now? At present, essentially.
Oh, well, I don't know what to say, because we don't understand it, just like you. And well, we have daily struggles because of these Ukrainian uniformizations, and especially in schools, we don't have Hungarian textbooks anymore, which makes it harder for Hungarian children to study. We don't have a proper Ukrainian education, which is unhappy for us to learn Ukrainian and study Ukrainian, and we don't know why is this situation we have here, because Hungary tries to help Ukraine as much as they can, and they try to make like a friendship with Ukraine, and Ukraine has a lot of benefits from Hungary, but they are still treat minorities like this way, and it's really hard to adapt with it. And as I read it in my essay, it's hard to work in here and just to live here. But Ukrainian people are mostly kind with Hungarians, and I think it's mostly just made up by politicians, the situation.
Thank you so much. I'm going to change that up a bit here, Susan. Susan, I've got a question more geared to you, if you don't mind, from the, and actually the students can, maybe the students can comment as well, but Patrick has asked, the translation loses so much emotion. And this is a tough question, by the way. Can you express what the English language misses in the translation? And that's not an easy question, but it's a bit of, we all know that those cliches that Shakespeare is better in Hungarian, right? These things we've all grown up with somebody. Okay, so Susan, if you want to make an attempt to answer that question, I'd really appreciate it.
Well, we had one translator who translated all the submissions into English, and most of the submissions were sent in Hungarian. And we had one Maria Mate, who was a student at the monk school,
great
University
student.
of Toronto, who translated did the opposite. She translated the English language ones, mine and my preface and Emeka's introduction were written in English, and she translated them into Hungarian. I have to say that probably what was missing from the Hungarian into the English was the poetry type of writing in which these students wrote these essays. There's an awful lot of metaphorical writing, an awful lot of writing of wistfulness, of expressing one particular author, essayist that I really wanted to get on this program today was wrote about how when she was young, she asked, why do we live so close to the border? Why is this village completely Hungarian? And what happened that we got ended up on this side of the border? And her grandfather said, the problem was the engineer who drew the line, the end of his pencil was too thick. And it was such a difficult thing to translate. This young child is listening to her grandfather saying, you know, why is it that I can hear in Zurich on the other side of the river, I can hear the bells ringing on Sunday. I can listen to the ice cream man going down, and I can hear he's saying ice cream in Hungarian, and we're stuck on this side of the border because there's a river between us. There's a little creek between us. And she expressed this so perfectly. You know, my grandfather said the pencil was too thick. The end of the pencil was too thick. Like that was a kind of an expression that I'm doing a rough translation, but it was so beautifully written in Hungarian. You see, my granddaughter, this is why we are on this side of the border. So, so many villages and towns that were cut in half or that were simply transferred because of the demands of the successor states, and no one ever came out to see just who lives there and what kind of population is there. There were no population censuses and determinations of who should belong where. And Woodrow Wilson's 11 points certainly didn't count in determining the Hungarian village's fate. So I have to say the poetry was what suffered the most. So there's a beautiful, you can read it, if you can read Hungarian, it's really beautifully written. These writers will potentially become serious writers, I hope. I hope they don't give up writing because they are lyrical and so beautifully written that I think that we will try to continue to translate them into other languages, possibly French will be number one. Thank you for the question.
It was a good question, and the answer was absolutely perfect. Thank you. And the Hungarian word for ice cream is in my limited Hungarian vocabulary.
Oh, good.
I don't know why, because I don't really like ice cream, but who knows? Tibor, we talk about that when I meet you in the summer, okay? That goes to all of you. We have some questions from our esteemed guests, but first, Susan, someone's saying, what is your Facebook page? Okay, I don't know if you could post that. Someone asking if we're posting this in YouTube. Yes, we will. The Monk School will post this. There's a bit of a process because we need to caption it, everybody, and that's more or less mandatory. And someone says, well, YouTube captions, but YouTube captions in a very mediocre way. And we have a very high bar here at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, so it doesn't come out imminently. But when it does, I'll circulate it with Dr. Papp and other members, so we'll have it posted for you. Quick, but our ambassador in Ottawa, I saw her hand up ages ago, and I made a mental note to come, and then I'm going to go to Emeka and then Ferenc, okay? So Ambassador, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And I just would like to very briefly, first of all, thank all these young students for their thoughts and sharing their truly heartfelt and honest and very brave experiences with us. And I just want to highlight how much it is valuable to all of us to hear these voices and support Hungarian communities. And as the Hungarian government has been putting a lot of efforts in the last decade into this, but it's an obligation, it's a duty. This is what we all feel genuinely from our genes, and it's very, very heartwarming to hear you from your in your own words, your experiences. And also I would like to just pick up one thought that Mr. De Varen mentioned in his encouragement to these young Hungarians to persevere and be active and don't give up. And I agree with that. But I would like to also add that they also need strong international voices to help them to persevere and then to attain and achieve the goals that we all share and we would like to contribute to the attainment of, to actually have their rights as minority communities in the countries where they live. And I think it takes a big international effort. I mean, Hungary, of course, is stepping up. And of course, organizations like wonderful Rákóczi Foundation is doing a tremendously important work. And we heard actually the experience and the testimonies from these students, how essential it is to facilitate these connections and support. But in order for all of us to actually have and facilitate a creation of environments where minority rights are granted, and these are very basic rights, we need strong international voices. If we could add the voices from the periphery, and that's why I truly value that Mr. De Varenne joined this discussion. And of course, our Minister, our Commissioner, Franz Kalmar has done a tremendous job in the Council of Europe. So both in Europe and internationally, wider internationally, a very important issue where I think proactivity is needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. So I think we've got time, Susan, for probably 2 more questions. I've got Dr. Satmari and then Commissioner Kalmar. And then Susan, I'm going to ask you to say the closing, because Susan, you're running, this is your book, this is your project. After these questions, I'm throwing to you because I think you're best suited to kind of send us on our way over the weekend and hope that for Dr. Satmari, the temperature goes above -20. Okay. Over
It'll
to
be
you.
a heat wave. There's a Hungarian expression, anyembed, which is essentially translated, you're as many people as the languages that you speak. There is something profoundly moving to actually read the views of young people in your own language, the language that you learned at home. My other name, were I to use it, is Mrs. George Riley. And so I obviously do not use my husband's name. And there's a certain amount of stubbornness involved in having a name that, quite frankly, very few Anglophones, very few Francophones are capable of pronouncing correctly. Even my husband doesn't. But it doesn't matter. The fact is that this is what I am. And so for me, it was really critical to hear the young people's views in contrast to what I may have learned 2 generations ago, essentially, from my parents. All right, because I mean, my father would be 105 years old were he still alive. And I wanted to know what the young people thought and what they felt and how they expressed themselves. And honestly, their hopes for a future are no different than, let's say, my children's own hopes for a future when they grew up here. People are labeled on the basis of their name or the dialect that they speak, and it's so wrong. I mean, nobody really wants to be mired in that sort of a terrible life. I really liked the essays. I think that these young people were honest. They spoke to things as they understood them. They weren't colored by, the arguments that learned political scientists and learned historians and so on have. This was their views, their experience, and they were very honest in the way in which they expressed them. And that's what touched me the most. I could hear the current generation. And let me tell you, I envy every one of those young people who participated in the Students Without Boundaries program, because I didn't go to Hungary. I left as an infant. I didn't go to Hungary until I was 34 years old. And that is something to see a child on the street who looks like my brother, although there is no relationship, to hear 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds speaking in your own native language. It's phenomenal. And I even had a chance to visit Ungvar, which happens to be where I was born. And I was very, very lucky to actually go through places that my mother had described to me. My father's family actually comes from Erdély, from Transylvania. Never been there. But I envy these young people, because to see the historic record of their ethnicity in that region is valuable. That's the reason why Canadian tourists all go back to the lands for a visit where their ancestors came from. And it's useful to remember that Hungarians are not that unusual in wanting to identify their roots and to acknowledge their roots. And so I think these young people's essays really are worth listening to, because they're honest. They're telling you what they know, born of their experience, not what the learned professors argue about.
Commissioner Kalmar.
Thank you very much. And thank you for all this webinar, which was very, very interesting and helpful. And I welcome again and I greet again Professor De Varenne. I'm very glad to have you here and to see you again after our conference in Strasbourg in October. So what I wanted to tell you, an interesting thing regarding Trianon peace treaty, so-called peace treaty. So we say, or people usually say, and mostly, so the winners say that the new borders were ethnic borders, or are ethnic borders. And let me tell you an example. This is also could be very interesting for you, Professor Austin, because it is a historical fact. So Szeged is situated at 50 kilometers from the Romanian border, and the Romanian border cross point, or this cross point, is in a village called Nagylak in Hungarian and Nadlak in Romania. So the village is split. There is a part in Hungary, another part, the biggest part is in Romania. So why was this village split by the border? Because there is a hemp factory there. And at that time, during the discussions and the peace talks in Paris, in Trianon, the owners of the factory were English citizens. They were English. And they expressed their wish that their property should remain in Hungary. So the English delegation to the peace treaty strived and succeeded to convince all the others that the border should be drawn there. So the border is immediately behind the factory. So this is a historical fact which shows that these borders, in fact, were not really ethnical borders. So another intervention or thing which I would like to comment a little bit regarding the fact that we should take to the international level the question of national minorities and protection of national minorities. Well, you should know, and I think that you know, that Hungary assured the presidency of the Council of Europe between May and November last year. During this presidency, we had 4 conferences, 2 in Budapest and 2 in Strasbourg. And we were very, very grateful and also very pleased to have among one of the speakers, of keynote speakers of the last conference, Professor De Varenne also. So there was a very interesting and important, or I would say 2 conclusions were very important for me. 2 conclusions of these 4 conferences. The first one was made by a judge of the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg, she said that this question of national minorities in Europe today is a forgotten question. One conclusion. The other conclusion was said by Professor de Varenne, who said that nowadays, when we speak about national minority protection, we cannot find steps forward, but steps backward. This is the situation today. And regarding laws and regulations, which are intended to protect national minorities, these regulations, laws, we cannot speak about laws, regulations, we can say about these that they are compulsory but not enforceable. So they are in the soft law category. We have the European Framework Convention for National Minorities, which we say it's compulsory for all the states who signed it. And every 3 years or 4 years, there is a monitoring procedure, a monitoring group going there, building up a report, which is presented in the Council of Europe to the Council of Ministers. And what happens after that? In fact, nothing. So they acknowledge that there are problems with in one or other countries regarding protection of national minorities, but in fact nothing happens. So there is no possibility to make enforceable these soft laws. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ferenc. Appreciate that intervention. Susan, we're at 2:58, and we're pretty good at sticking to our time here. I wanted to say, but Susan, I can't resist just because when you asked this, I'm handing over to you, but I wanted to say hello to a mutual friend, Susan, because I got a note from Catherine Lukitz, who's not just a friend, but she works with me. I wanted to say hello because I haven't seen him in a long time, to Tibor Fekete, because he's out there in the audience. That's also Andrew's uncle.
Excellent.
So
Excellent.
Tibor, I wish you could say hi back, but I was thinking about you. And for those of you who don't know, Tibor, Hungarian studies at the University of Toronto is very much owed to the let's say perseverance of people like Tibor and Andrew's father as well, and Susan too. So it's just nice to think about these people at this time. And greetings to all of you. I'll say goodbye now. I'm not going to hit the leave button until Susan gives me permission. But Susan, I really think the last word has to go to you. Well, it was such a terrific afternoon, Susan.
It was.
And really, I got so many nice notes in the box that I didn't read to. And special thanks to those amazing students. And I wish all of you very well. And I'll see all of you again soon when I get you back in my classroom. Thanks.
I just, I'm very thrilled to have brought together such an amazing group of individual students and speakers. And Franz de Varenne, special thanks goes out to you for attending and for being with us this afternoon. We really appreciate it. Ambassador Salazar, so much appreciate your comments and your time as well. Ferenc András Kalmar, Ministerial Commissioner, very, very distinguished group of ministers and friends and ambassadors. And Valir Palkovic, thank you very much for being here. I do want to thank Robert Austin, number one, and for hosting this book launch and for placing it in such an important position. We thank you to Andrew and Genoveva and Tibor and Johanna for presenting. I really do appreciate it. And I'd like to give special thanks to Emeka, who wrote the introduction to the volume and was so instrumental in giving me encouragement that this is a worthwhile project to proceed with, and it's so important. And I'd like to end with the words, 1,000-year-old words of King Saint Stephen, who said, "A unilingual country with only one culture is weak and frail. And I think that's so important now in the days of so many cultures mixing in so many countries, that the nation state is dead as far as historians, many historians have written that a pure nation state is dead. But it would be so important to remember that we are the sum of our parts, and these students have so much to give to the countries in which they live, and all they are asking for is acceptance, and to call the place their home, and to not be discriminated against and not be hated. And this is the message ultimately of the book that will come through to anyone who picks it up. It's available on Amazon.ca, Amazon.com. And one final word from Tamási Áron, writer: we are in this world so that we can be at home in it somewhere. And that's the goal of this book, is to make them feel home somewhere. Thank you to all of you. And Andrew just tweeted, actually sent out the Facebook page and the everywhere where we can be reached. So thank you, Robert, for hosting it so wonderfully and for all the kind introductions. And thank you to all of you. Unfortunately, I can't give you a big hand, but I would really like to, because you were all tremendously in contributing to this wonderful, successful afternoon. Thank you. All the best, and good evening to all the Europeans. And we hope that this will continue. All the best.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Ciao, everybody. Bye.
Merci. Au revoir.
Merci.
Au revoir.
Au revoir. À bientôt.
À la prochaine.
Szervusztok.
Bye bye. Au revoir.
Bye.
Au revoir.
Köszönöm.
Bye bye. Szervusztok.